I am a righteous teacher, most often known, more formally, as the teacher of righteousness. I am the leader of a tribe of true Israelites, though some prefer to call us a separatist community. Our burden is to preserve and abide by our sacred laws, our holy Torah. We are the true Israel, untouched and unblemished. We believe now, as we have always believed, that our true temple, burned and demolished long ago by the Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, will be rebuilt by divine agency and holy power. In the meantime, the so-called Second Temple, rebuilt under the auspices of foreign Persian overlords, has been presided over by Zadokite priests in league with a series of pagan empires, from the Ptolemies of Egypt to the Seleucid dynasty of Syria and eventually to the Romans.
It was the Seleucid king, Antiochus III, who, on taking the land from the Ptolemies, issued a decree which was, in his words, in honor of the temple, thereby confirming the prominence and power of the Zadokites and the Judaism they fostered. We Essenes, known also as Enochians, could not abide this outrage. We withdrew from the rest of the people to forge our own way, preparing the way in the desert for the one who will come, the Anointed One of Israel.
There are three philosophical sects among the Jews. The followers of the first of which are the Pharisees, of the second, the Sadducees, and the third sect, which pretends to a more severe discipline, are called Essenes. These last are Jews by birth, and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. These Essenes reject pleasures as an evil, but esteem continence and the conquest over our passions to be virtue. They neglect wedlock, but choose out other persons' children, while they are pliable and fit for learning, and esteem them to be of their kindred, and form them according to their own manners. They do not absolutely deny the fitness of marriage, by which the succession of mankind is continued, but they guard against the lascivious behavior of women, and are persuaded that none of them preserve their fidelity to one man.
It was the book of Enoch, today considered pseudepigrapha, literally a false writing, that formed the basis of much of what the Essenes believed. Josephus has much more to say about the Essenes, and specifically mentions that they were devoted to ancient writings, his way of referencing Enoch. And that's a clue that the Enochians and the Essenes were likely the same group.
They dispense their anger after a just manner and restrain their passion. They are eminent for fidelity, and are the ministers of peace. Whatsoever they say also is firmer than an oath, but swearing is avoided by them, and they esteem it worse than perjury. For they say that he who cannot be believed without swearing by God is already condemned. They also take great pains in studying the writings of the ancients.
I am a Zadokite priest, of the family line designated by our prophet Ezekiel to be the rightful keepers of the temple cult and sacrificial system. Ezekiel's prophecy was uttered several decades after the destruction of King Solomon's great temple, and describes our family's loyalty to our faith, while the rest of our nation rebelled against divine precept. We were the ones who returned from Babylonian captivity to rebuild our sacred shrine, centering our lives around our holy covenant and the Torah given to us by Moses, while those known as Essenes chose instead to separate from the people and indulge in fantasies about the ancient patriarch Enoch and the misbehavior of rebel angels. I have no patience with them or their insolence.
Onias III was known as a pious man who opposed the encroachment of Greek Hellenistic culture on the faith and culture of Israel. As it happened, he turned out to be the last Torah-faithful Zadokite high priest. Upon his death, he was succeeded by his brother Yeshua, which corresponds with the name Jesus, though he changed it to the Greek name Iason, or Jason.
The Zadokite grip on power in those days was coming to an end, which meant that we Essenes were perfectly positioned to benefit. Of course, our greatest challenge was how to convey our religious experiences in a manner that was meaningful, especially in light of the political and religious chaos breaking out around us. This, after all, was a period of continuing social and political unrest, Ptolemaic rule having yielded to Seleucid rule, which in turn became increasingly harsh toward their subject Israelite population. During this time, a maniacal king rose in Syria, whose cruelty was matched only by his eccentricity. He was known as Antiochus IV, though he applied to himself the moniker Epiphanes, meaning manifestation, in Greek, for he conceived himself to be the incarnation of a god.
His actions toward us Israelites provoked outrage from the beginning. He sacked the high priest in those days, the Hellenist named Jason, in favor of a much more radical Hellenist, a Jew with the Greek name Menelaus. When it came to consolidating his hold over his empire, Greek culture would be the key, and Antiochus insisted on imposing it. We Essenes could only stand on the sidelines.
Imagine the shock when the non-Zadokite high priest Menelaus took power. He hailed from the house of Bilgah and tried to change the whole Zadokite Torah. His so-called reforms were aimed not at destroying Judaism, but only a certain kind of Judaism, not Essene, but Zadokite Judaism. Next, Antiochus went forth as a conqueror, stretching the boundaries of his kingdom beyond the land of Israel, all the way to Egypt. The book of Daniel cryptically describes him as a little horn which emerged from a he-goat, namely Alexander the Great.
Then the he-goat grew very great, but at the peak of his power his big horn was broken. In its place, 4 conspicuous horns sprouted toward the 4 winds of heaven. From one of them emerged a small horn, which extended itself greatly toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land.
Antiochus IV laid siege to the city of Alexandria and made ready his final assault. At that point, he was unexpectedly confronted by a Roman legate, an emissary from the great empire to the west, with which Egypt had formed a military pact. Rome would by no means tolerate the Seleucid upstart subjugating its Ptolemaic ally. The legate demanded that Antiochus withdraw his army immediately. The Seleucid emperor, realizing that he was faced with a vastly superior force, nonetheless wanted desperately to save face. He wanted more time so that he could decide the matter. But the legate simply took a long stick, drew a circle in the sand, completely surrounding Antiochus, and directed him to decide now. Embarrassed and ashamed, the Seleucid king began a humiliating retreat up the Mediterranean coast. Back in Jerusalem, word quickly spread that this was no ordinary retreat. The king must be dead. A call to arms issued by the deposed high priest Jason stirred the population. Though previously conceived as the enemy of the faithful, Jason was suddenly their hero. Unfortunately for the Judeans, their budding revolt was met by a cruel reality. Rumors of the king's death were greatly exaggerated. Having been humiliated in Egypt, Antiochus unleashed his full fury on the Jerusalemites. Advancing on the holy city, he proceeded to crush the revolt and reinstate the radical Hellenist Menelaus. Some 2 years after his defeat in Egypt, he initiated the first true religious persecution in history.
He insolently invaded the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the lampstand for the light with all its fixtures, the offering table, the cups and the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the golden ornament on the facade of the temple. He stripped off everything and took away the gold and silver and the precious vessels. He also took all the hidden treasures he could find. Taking all this, he went back to his own country, after he had spoken with great arrogance and shed much blood.
Worse still, a command was issued to slaughter a swine on the holy altar of the temple. No greater desecration of this most sacred site was imaginable. But there was more to come. Antiochus ordered the fashioning of a great statue presumably of Zeus, which was then hauled into the sacred precincts. In bitter irony, it was placed exactly atop the defiled altar. A terrible assignation was applied to the dreaded image, the abomination that makes desolate, or the abomination of desolation. Students of comparative religion should note that several generations later, another spiritual descendant of the Essenes, Jesus of Nazareth, would make reference to the same events.
Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those in Judea flee into the mountains.
In two passages almost universally misunderstood by modern readers, we find reference to these events.
Yea, he magnified himself, even to the ruler of the host, and the daily sacrifice was taken away by him, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. They will profane the sanctuary, the fortress, and shall remove the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the desolating abomination.
Elsewhere we read,
And there was great mourning for Israel in every place where they dwelt, and the rulers and the elders groaned. Virgins and young men languished, and the beauty of the women was disfigured. Every bridegroom took up lamentation. She who sat in the bridal chamber mourned, and the land was shaken on account of its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was covered with shame.
After 2 years of such outrage, the horrors were destined to get worse. Scrolls of the books of Moses, the Torah, were seized and burned. Then the murders began.
Whoever was found with a scroll of the covenant, and whoever observed the law, was condemned to death by royal decree. So they used their power against Israel, against those who were caught, each month in the cities. On the 25th day of each month, they sacrificed on the altar erected over the altar of holocausts. Women who had had their children circumcised were put to death, in keeping with the decree, with the babies hung from their necks. Their families also, and those who had circumcised them, were killed. But many in Israel were determined and resolved in their hearts not to eat anything unclean. They preferred to die rather than to be defiled with unclean food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die.
The winds of war were destined to change the course of history for Israel and subsequently for the whole of Western civilization. For a band of freedom fighters would arise, who came to be known as the Maccabees.
They would one day retake Jerusalem, cleanse the defiled temple, and light again the long extinguished menorah. A great festival would accompany these events, a festival of light which came to be known as Hanukkah.
They proclaimed faithfulness to the Torah of Moses, which used to be the exclusive domain of the Zadokite priesthood. The Maccabees came from a priestly house, but they had no Zadokite pedigree. Still, their line, the house of Hashmon, became the new priestly house, as the Zadokites were relegated to the sidelines, many fleeing to Egypt. In time, the Zadokite Torah became the Jewish Torah. The minority Enochians, who we can also call Essenes, were perfectly positioned to win followers. The end of the Zadokite priesthood provided just the confidence they needed. They supported the pious among the people, many of whom suffered martyrdom, while actively opposing the wicked priest Menelaus and the Seleucid king Antiochus IV. History, as they saw it, was condemned to degeneration.
But the people who know their God will be strong and will work. And those who understand among the people shall teach many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by exile, and spoil 4 days. And when they stumble, they shall be helped with a little help, but many will join them with hypocrisy. And many of those who understand shall stumble, to refine and purge them, and to make white, to the time of the end. Because it is still for the appointed time.
As reflected in Daniel's prophecy, the Essene worldview became increasingly apocalyptic. It was a view communicated in a series of dream visions, presumably composed about the time of the Maccabean revolt. That's the mysterious text we'll take up next. There's so much more to come.